also take part in the conversation. So Matt, I was just greeting everyone and thanking everyone that's here today. Also thanking our hosts, CGM lawyers that have us here in their beautiful headquarters. So as you all know, usually we have our first hour dedicated to discuss a specific subject, and then our second hour of the meeting to discuss our internal working groups and our agenda. So the first hour today is going to be led by Matt Ellis. Matt is the head of the Latin American practice at Miller Chevalier. He's a specialist in investigations and compliance, has lots of experience in working on cross-border matters, including with Brazil. And I've given Matt an impossible task, which is to predict the future, but also explain to us a little bit on the present and the past. So the agenda I've asked Matt to focus today is on the FCPA pausing, what's expected on enforcement in the next few months, what the U.S. law and compliance community have been awaiting from the DOJ and so on and forth. And Matt so kindly prepared a presentation for us and has decided to dedicate us this 1 hour. Matt, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Rafael. Bom dia a todos. Uma honra estar com vocês hoje. Brasileiros, adoro o Brasil. Eu vejo a Carla e outros amigos lá. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade. E hoje a gente vai falar em inglês, falar sobre a pausa de FCPA. It's a topic that is very hot right now in Washington, D.C., as you can imagine. There are many different angles. The dynamics are changing rapidly, so there is much to discuss. But I've prepared a short presentation to give you an overview of some of the basic elements of the conversation. And hopefully that will trigger discussions from this group, a group of real leaders in investigations and compliance in Brazil. So again, thank you for the opportunity. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so let's start with the basics. It all started on February 10th of this year. Everyone remembers where they were when they received the news of the FCPA pause. Trump created the pause through an executive order. And as you might have learned by now, the presidency, the administration in the United States has the power to issue immediate and drastic policies based on emergencies and national security. And what President Trump did was describe the continued enforcement of the FCPA as creating an emergency situation in the United States. At its essence, what he argues is it puts U.S. companies at a competitive disadvantage. And based on that, he ordered the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to create a pause of 6 months, which will continue until August 9th, 2025, this year. And three actions were directed. First, that any ongoing, any new investigations be paused. So no new FCPA investigations would be initiated during the 6-month period. Second, to review ongoing investigations and pause those and use the time to review those cases to see if it makes sense or not to move forward with those cases. And then third, to use the time to develop guidelines that would govern FCP enforcement going forward after the pause is lifted. Now, this obviously has raised several questions about, what happens next. And we are really in a world of speculation. And what everyone continues to say is, look, nobody has a crystal ball, right? No one knows what's going to happen after the 6-month pause. Although there are several theories out there. First theory relates to what the guidelines might look like when they are drafted. And what we anticipate is that we will see a restricting of interpretation of FCP enforcement and actual enforcement policies and priorities. There has been quite a lot of criticism. I'm sure you have seen it with your client base as well, that FCP enforcement simply has gotten too broad, that it's gotten too aggressive. Theories on the meaning of the statute have extended beyond what many argue is the appropriate statutory scope, whether that's extending the accounting provisions to the types of internal controls that perhaps aren't traditionally accounting and financial in nature, whether it's expanding, the notion of a corrupt act to gifts and hospitality, internships to the children of government officials. And so what many people anticipate is that when we do see guidelines, it will be in a way that serves to streamline how the FCPA is interpreted and how it is applied in practice. We also might see efforts to go back to current cases, especially those cases that are in reporting periods under deferred prosecution agreements or under non-prosecution agreements, and efforts to close those cases out. Now, this is something we are already starting to see. As you might have seen in the Glencore case, where the company received a monitor, that monitorship was basically ended. A case that we've worked on for 7 years, and this will be public soon. But we have achieved an early termination of the NPA. Now, what's interesting there is in that case, again, which will be public soon, we started the discussions of the early termination back under the Biden administration. There was a recognition by the Biden DOJ that this was a company that had done everything right in terms of modifying its compliance program, in terms of closing gaps of its compliance program. And so the discussions had already begun. The termination agreement was ended under the Trump administration. So, it might be misinterpreted in a way as solely based on new Trump administration policies. That's a side point. In any event, what we know for sure is that the Trump administration is interested in bringing these cases to a close. Now, that has also generated a question: would it be possible now for defense attorneys like us to go back and extinguish prior fines and penalties that have already been paid under prior and recent resolutions. And it's a very important question. You know, on one hand, the Trump administration, in sending this messaging, suggests that it might be open. You know, as a law firm that regularly deals with the Department of Justice and the SEC, in practice, we see very little interest or appetite for that path. And if I had to read the crystal ball myself, I would say that they're really in practical perspectives, there are limits to the ability to go back and actually open up resolutions and recoup any fines or penalties that have already been paid. What we've been messaging, and I'm sure you've heard this from other law firms, and you very well might be messaging the same thing to your client bases, is be careful. Be careful, because while the FCPA is paused, risks remain. And, you know, there are a number of points that are important to make in this context. First, the law still exists. The law is still in force. Just because DOJ's enforcement of the law has paused, that doesn't mean that engaging in this conduct would not technically represent a violation. You know, more specifically, it does not create new legal defenses or exceptions where perhaps they did not exist before. The Attorney General still has the ability under the order to approve investigations, you know, despite the pause. And a second point to make, and it's interesting because in February, this was part of the crystal ball. It was a speculation, and now we're seeing it become a reality. The point that other authorities, perhaps in other countries, might step up and become more aggressive. You know, there's a theory that if there is an enforcement void, then countries, especially those that have embraced the OECD anti-bribery convention, would step up and fill the enforcement void. We're already starting to see that. You very well might have seen the news that the UK, France, and Switzerland have come together and formed an anti-corruption coordinating body to help advance more effectively their corruption investigations. You might have seen the recent news from the UK bringing a case against a partner of Lloyd's operating in Ecuador for the failure to prevent bribery offense. And you might have seen the news out of California as well. The state attorney general in California has publicly announced that, look, even though at the federal level, the Department of Justice has paused FCP enforcement, California, through its own statutory construction, has shown a willingness to investigate companies for FCPA violations, the FCPA violation being a predicate offense to the state offenses. So in a way, this is already beginning to happen. Now, you add to that the dynamic right now at play in the global context, the anger and disputes that the Trump administration appears to be generating through its aggressive tariffs and the resulting trade wars. And you can envision a scenario where other governments perhaps advance their enforcement against US companies operating globally, as perhaps not because of the pause or the trade wars, but that being an element in the overall context. Another dynamic that we are anticipating is greater scrutiny from the media, from whistleblowers, from shareholders. That, you know, I was just, to be honest, on a training with the CEO, CFO, chief legal officer of a major airport. And it was a compliance training, and we covered a number of different topics: economic sanctions, money laundering controls, and anti-corruption. And as soon as I mentioned FCPA, the entire room raised the question about the pause. And so it was just another indicator for me in my own experience that, you know, the concept of the pause has gained quite a lot of attention throughout global business. And that has the potential to invite greater scrutiny on how companies do business. Another dynamic that some are anticipating is, after the pause is ended, we very well might see a scenario whereby the Trump administration is using FCPA enforcement as a tool. And that's a controversial topic, right? I mean, some would say ideally when it comes to law enforcement, you want some sense of, you know, neutrality and fairness, not picking investigations and targets based in order to advance policy objectives. On the other hand, there's some very respected and prominent lawyers in Washington, D.C., who are vocally advocating this, that, hey, why would it be problematic for the Trump administration to selectively go after companies from China that have engaged in corrupt acts, you know, in the United States, in other countries? Why would it be problematic, you know, if President Petro in Colombia is not falling in line, just as an example, not following in line with Trump's immigration policy? You know, why not start to target companies that are from Colombia and aligned with Petro? So one could see that developing. And then finally, what the pause has meant is a redirection of the DOJ's focus on other areas that are closer to Trump administration's heart. And I'll give you 3 examples that we're beginning to see more interest and more activity. The first relates to fraud in the context of customs. You can imagine this whole new tariff regime being sprung upon U.S. importers and the U.S. economy, what seems and feels like overnight. All of a sudden, U.S. importers and companies in the United States are needing to absorb 10%, 25%, maybe even more of tariffs. And so you can see aggressive business people on the front lines, perhaps engaging in questionable conduct at customs in order to alleviate that impact. Questions about how maybe a company calculates valuation, reporting of quantities at customs, reporting of country of origin. And so we're already starting to see, just recently, the first investigation of a U.S. importer for incorrect customs reporting. A second is economic sanctions. This is a tool that the Trump administration continues to, you know, it was of interest previously under Biden, and even before that, going back to Obama. But now the Trump administration really continues to embrace the concept of economic sanctions, be it Venezuela, be it Iran. So that is an area of focus of the Department of Justice. And then the third area, which I'm sure you've heard of, is creating new tools to proceed against organized crime and cartels. And one recent development which has really shaken Washington, D.C., is designating 8 cartels as terrorists, as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because once you technically designate certain organized crime as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, it automatically creates exposure under the Anti-Terrorism Act in the United States, which creates a much greater scope for the type of conduct that can implicate criminal liability for companies that are providing material support to these FTOs, or companies that are aiding and abetting these FTOs. And it triggers a number of other potential consequences. For example, civil litigation, plaintiffs, perhaps a family whose member is lost in a terrorist act can bring a civil case against any company that was providing support to that terrorist group and recover treble damages. It can also implicate seizure of assets that are arguably connected to the FTO. So this is all to say that the pause, in a way, has triggered or has opened up room for focus in other areas that are closer to the Trump administration's heart. One other anecdote I wanted to share, and I guess this is the opportunity to maybe pat my own self on the back. Please forgive me, but in January, before Trump assumed office, I published an article in Law 360. It was January 9th. And at that point, there were many law firms in Washington, D.C. that were speculating and publishing about what white-collar enforcement might look like under the Trump 2.0. And the majority of them, almost all of them, and these are good firms, respected firms, but so many lawyers at that time were saying, look, nothing's going to change. At the end of the day, white collar will continue, FCPA enforcement will continue. And I wrote an article, and frankly, it was not easy to write this because many would argue that, it was publishing predictions that were against our firm's own interest, right? But I made 4 core predictions. First, that Latin America would be center place, would be a focus of the Trump administration. And that certainly has played out. Why is that? Well, immigration, organized crime, movement of jobs away from the US to the region, all of these, China's influence in the region, these are all areas that Trump really, really cares about. A second thing I predicted was that Trump would aggressively utilize tariffs as a policy tool. Obviously, that has happened. Now, maybe that's not that great of a surprise. All we had to do was look at the type of people that Trump was appointing to the U.S. Trade Representative's office, to Commerce. These are people who deeply believe in protectionism, in import substitution, in tariffs as a good measure. A third thing I predicted was the use of economic sanctions, right, which is what we're seeing. What was interesting is you might remember at the end of January when President Petro in Colombia turned around the planes that were coming to Colombia, bringing the undocumented immigrants to leave them back in Colombia, and he turned them around and sent them back. And Trump immediately threatened to put Petro and his family and his close associates on the SDN, on OFAC's list. So Petro quickly fell in line. And then finally, the fourth thing I predicted was we have to anticipate a drop-off in FCPA, because all you have to do, and here's some examples, all you have to do is look at what Trump has said in the past. You know, and perhaps in the first administration, we can point to the numbers and we can show that in the first Trump administration, there was actually an increase in FCPA activity. You know, that is true. This administration is much, much different. The people he has close to him are wired much differently, have much different substantive areas of focus and interest and priorities. And so, you know, you look in the past how Trump has described the FCPA. So again, it's not a surprise now, looking in hindsight, that he has issued the pause. I think, and perhaps the right side of this slide is, in my view, the most important factor. And this is something that I hope we can discuss. And frankly, I'm really I'm interested in your thoughts on this topic, because my own prediction is that the FCPA pause will lead directly to a spike in fraud and corruption risk in the region. And this is first based simply on anecdotal evidence, like what our team is experiencing. And when you, you know, when you have conversations with important players in Latin America and you hear them raise the fact that the FCPA has been paused, and you see them cutting back on their compliance departments and maybe shifting some compliance tasks over to internal audit. And we all know as professionals why that might be problematic. You know, when you see this happening, you get the sensation that the pause has potentially triggered this heightened corruption and fraud risk. And when you consider the data as well, it leads you to the same conclusion. In 2024, we conducted the another corruption survey in Latin America. Every 4 years since 2008, we've conducted this survey. And we partner with law firms throughout the region. We send out the survey. We get responses from large multinationals, from multilatinas, from small mom and pop stores. We try to get a good wide range of feedback from business people in the region about their perceptions of corruption risk and about their compliance practices and about how they perceive enforcement threats. And in 2024, we had more than 1,000 respondents to this survey. And one question we ask every 4 years is, who do you think, what country do you think will lead the charge in corruption enforcement going forward? And consistently, I mean, this shouldn't be a surprise, but consistently throughout the last, since 2008, the United States has been way, way out ahead of the pack. And this tells me that FCPA enforcement has played a significant role in shaping how the risk calculation is made in Latin America. Do we engage in questionable conduct or do we not? How serious are we about corporate compliance, or is it a low priority? Do we take the chance and go with a third party that has some red flags, but no obvious indication of wrongdoing? Or are we a bit more risk adverse? The FCPA, the data shows, has played a major force. Now, it also won't be a surprise to you, a Brazilian audience, that when we did the survey in 2016, Brazil And even in 2020, you can see that light blue line for Brazil had very strong indicators. It was Lava Jato, it was Judge Moro, it was all of the prosecutors who were brave and making these huge advancements. So Brazil was coming onto the scene. Now, for obvious reasons that I certainly don't need to describe to this audience, that has fallen, and Brazil is even lower than Uruguay now on the indicator. I don't know about you, but I don't know any important cases coming out of Uruguay. So that sends a message on where Brazil falls. But the overall point is FCPA enforcement has mattered. And now that it's off the table, we have to assume that fraud and corruption risk is going to go up. Another data point, I don't have a slide for this, but I can just tell it to you. Another data point that we track in this survey is related to compliance programs and compliance activity. And what we found over the years is that since 2008, more countries have been embracing corporate compliance, anti-corruption compliance in particular, as an important feature of their company. Again, you have seen it firsthand throughout Lava Jato. Brazil has really been in the lead on local, homegrown compliance expertise. And the data shows it. You know, we're seeing from Brazil, 85% of Brazilian companies responding to our survey have anti-corruption trainings. 90% have policies in place. You know, all of these indicators, whether they have internal reporting lines, whether they have dedicated compliance teams. For Brazil, we're up in the 80% and above. Another important thing we detected in the 2024 corruption survey was that while traditionally region-wide, many companies and 80% and up of companies had policies, had training, had compliance clauses and contracts, the real basics. What we started to see in 2024 for the first time was many more companies, like up to the 65% and 75% range, more companies saying that they have more subtle compliance protocols, things like third-party due diligence, or things like charitable contribution policies. So what this tells us is throughout the 2010s, up through 2024, you've seen this growth throughout Latin America in compliance, now to a level of perhaps sophistication, right? Where more companies are doing more sophisticated work on compliance. I say all this to paint the context. We have to assume now with the pause that all of those trend lines, that all of those efforts perhaps will pause as well. And what does that mean? That means we are in a new place in Latin America where companies have to consider that fraud risk is more common, that corruption risk is more common. And what I've been telling our clients is the following. Companies are going to face a question now. Which direction will they move in? Will they be a company that decides to loosen controls, seeing compliance as a cost center, seeing compliance perhaps as something that gets in the way of business rather than advances business? Or are they going to retrench? Are they going to refocus on compliance in light of the fact that risks are higher? And that generates another conversation, which is that FCPA compliance is no longer just about protecting the company from the DOJ or the SEC. No. anti-corruption compliance, now the companies who do this right realize that there is a sound business case for having strong controls, for knowing where your money is going, for forcing business people to make the case when they want to bring on a new third party, for boosting the morale. Companies want to work, employees want to work for companies that are ethical companies, that do the right thing, that don't cut those corners. And finally, the risk assessment tools that we've all become so accustomed to manage corruption risk, those same tools with modifications can be brought to bear to address these other emerging risks, whether it's interaction with organized crime, whether it's economic sanctions, whether it's customs, or whatever it might be. So the last slide, and then Rafael, I'm so excited to pass it back over to you and to listen to this group and its reactions. And I'm also obviously open to answer any questions to the extent I can. But the final point to make is we've really been counseling companies on what to do in light of the pause. And this is something you very well might already be doing, but there is an opportunity for companies to use the pause to message internally that, hey, look, we are still dedicated to compliance, and compliance is the value of compliance is much greater than just shielding us from the FCPA and the Department of Justice. And, the pause is only a pause, and, enforcement risk can come from other sources, and just using this as an opportunity to message internally. We've seen many companies do that with success. So passing it back over to you, Rafael. Algumas perguntas, por favor. This has been such a great opportunity, and I've enjoyed these last 40 minutes. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Matt. It was really interesting, and I think a lot of us will have questions. Usually I have like 8 to 9 questions myself, which makes that I'm the only one speaking. So today I'm going to try very hard not to do that. So I know Carla already has a question. I'm going to pass over to her, and so we can start rounding the table.
Carla always has the hardest question. Carla, you always have the hardest question, so please be easy on me.
Not at all. When you have so many data points that it's going to be easy already predicting the future. I'm going to focus on the present. So, and thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really insightful and focused on practical terms. I had not heard about the statement from the California AG. I thought that was really interesting. Rafael and I was chatting on what legal basis they would do that, but I'm sure that's a good see. That would be a question in itself. But in any case, I wanted to see your view on what is going on the ground. So we had a case, for example, which was in the middle of production, and you basically can't get a hold of the DOJ. And at the same time, although there is no pause in relation to the SEC enforcement, we're also not seeing much from them as well. Do you have the same perception that although the order is focusing on the DOJ, other authorities haven't been that active?
Yeah, great question, and I should have touched on that. The SEC, when the DOJ pause was announced, one of the takeaways that many of us in Washington were saying was, hey, watch out, this doesn't technically apply to the SEC, which is true. But there is what we're hearing, there is a gutting of the SEC, FCPA enforcement unit. Charles Kane is reportedly leaving the SEC. And you might remember at ACI conference at the Gaylord in early December of last year, Charles Kane, who's been the head enforcer of FCPA at SEC for what was it, 19 years, 20 years? I mean, he's been there since early on, and he said, look, I've been here, I'm not going anywhere. Well, guess what? He is going somewhere now. So yes, SEC has been touched. At the federal level in the United States, there really is not much appetite for enforcement.
Thank you, Matt, for your presentation. I'm Juliana. I am actually curious about the California case that you mentioned, because I also saw on the media certain cases that were not paused. And I have the same question than my colleagues. On what basis are these investigations ongoing? What's going on? I don't know whether you have further information about that, but we would love to hear your thoughts.
So, and this is quite relevant for this group, because I understand that part of IBRAC's scope is competition law, right? Which has been so important in Brazil for so long. What California has done is it has embedded this enforcement priority into its unfair competition law, which is a state law. And much like money laundering, it can look to other laws as predicate offenses. So if California investigators determine that an FCPA violation has occurred, that bribery of foreign officials has occurred, it can investigate that under its own state unfair trade law. It's an announcement that was made in just the last couple of weeks. Law firms have done great alerts on the topic. We haven't yet issued an alert. As we all know, these cases are very complex and they take a lot of time, but the fact is, any company with presence in California should be aware that there are other sources of investigations and enforcement out there.
So I will make just one of our questions, and then I will also open the floor. We've had here with us on a previous meeting the former French minister Sapin, which is one of the authors of Sapin-II, the French legislation on anti-corruption. And I remember Mr. Sapin telling us that the inspiration for France to adopt the law in a big sense was because they were feeling that French companies were being enforced in the US. And they wanted to make sure if French companies are going to be enforced somewhere, they should be enforced in France. And so it was a lot based on his account, on the reaction to the US enforcement, right? And then I go back to your presentation, and one thing that's a big question mark for me, which is, okay, how is the rest of the world going to respond if indeed the US starts to de-escalate on enforcement? And I understood from your presentation that there's one group that gambles that this could spike enforcement elsewhere. And I think there's another group that gambles that it's the other way around. And my question goes on how you position yourself here, and especially considering you mentioned the French, UK, and Switzerland agreement, which could favor the first group, but at the same time, the European Council sent to the European Parliament the omnibus package, which pretty much tries to say the following. So we've been giving to European companies a lot of obligations in this past few years. The CSRD law is too heavy on due diligence. We need to remain European companies competitive. So let's simplify it for them. So which could indicate a movement from Europe also in less enforcement. So my question to you is, do you yourself position among those that believe indeed there's going to be a spike, or do you believe that there's going to be a reaction chain in the sense of less enforcement because no country would like to punish their own companies?
I mean, it's Rafael, it's such a great question. And, you know, I can see as well as anyone else strong arguments on both sides. I think one element here of the picture that we really can't lose sight of is the fact that the international, you know, business community now is at a point where it's really, really hard to ignore unethical conduct in business, right? To sweep it under the rug. Why? Well, obviously, you used to have government investigation threat that might continue as we're discussing, but the markets really demand now that that companies are clean. I mean, it's hard to get financing if a company can't show that it doesn't have a solid compliance. You know, we work for private equity firms all the time, and they certainly aren't loosening their efforts. They don't want to be investing in some company in Brazil that is cutting corners, right, and perhaps not doing business ethically. So you have lenders, you have business partners who might not want to, you know, link up with companies that don't have strong controls in place. And so if we are at a point in international business where ethical conduct is really a baseline expectation, you would anticipate that governments follow suit, that they align with that view, right? That they don't simply look the other way, but that they, you know, do what they should be doing, which is enforcing the laws. And so if you consider it that way, maybe Trump administration's view is an exception. And you read the executive order and the assumptions on that it's based on, really, we all know they're false assumptions. I mean, the FCPA does not put U.S. companies at a competitive disadvantage, right? We all know that enforcement of the FCPA has been against non-U.S. companies as much, if not more, than against U.S. companies. And so that executive order seems, you know, as one of my colleagues said, it seems like it was written by somebody who was living in the 1980s, right? It's not really reflecting the current state of play. And if that is all true, then you would have to think that we will begin to see meaningful enforcement from at least some governments. Not imagine what the world looks like if no government enforces anti-corruption laws. Like, it's just really unfathomable. So if I had to bet, I would bet that there will be enforcement coming from some source. We're already starting to see inklings of that.
According to your very interesting mention that the executive order seems to have been written by someone in the 80s. Someone told me, and I'm not sure about this, but considering that American companies are not in a worse condition because of the FCPA, would perhaps a tentative explanation for the rational movement of suspension of the FCPA to be the intention to humiliate the Department of Justice? Would President Trump do all this to make the Department of Justice rebalance its own importance? Would it be feasible?
Certainly. I mean, that is, it's a great question. And I think you have to, the answer is yes. And it is really an amazing thing to understand and to accept that the president would make decisions that are so consequential, that change in such a dramatic way the way government has worked, simply because of, you know, his own interest or but we're seeing it in other places. I mean, look, the US government has wiped out USAID, which has been such an important aspect of the federal government, right? And there has been great consensus over the years on the value of international development, democracy promotion, aid, the value to our own national interest in generating peace and stability, et cetera. And so just having President Trump and Elon Musk and others just wipe it out, I mean, no one would have guessed that would be anywhere possible. And here it's happened. And so, you know, it is not out of the question to think that the real push or the real purpose of gutting FCPA was in some way to weaken DOJ. Now, my own sense at the end of the day is you really have a realignment at DOJ. You know, the DOJ still has a purpose to investigate bad conduct, but the bad conduct that Trump is interested in, again, cartels, organized crime, immigration, people who are evading customs, economic sanctions violators. So I think it's more of a realignment rather than a way to simply give a black eye to DOJ, right? But it might be a little of everything. It's very tough to tell. These are great questions.
How are you? This is Adriana. Good to see you.
Oh, Adriana, I didn't see you there. So good to
I'm
see you.
here. My pleasure. Thank you for your insights. Very valuable to all of us. One good thing about this press release that Attorney General Bonta released regarding the FCPA is that perhaps we have a chance to live in California and work there, no? Because for most of us, the East Coast has been the key destination for work. So now perhaps we have a chance
Exactly.
to live in California.
Good point.
But my question to you relates to all the efforts that Elon Musk has been making to reduce costs. And I wonder how has this affected the fraud division? I haven't seen layoffs at the fraud division, and perhaps if you can comment on that, how this situation has affected the FCPA and fraud division more broadly. And the second point that I wanted to make, to ask you, is to comment on the role of the IDB, World Bank, OECD in this new geopolitical context, no, where the DOJ, as you said, has stepped back, and he has been the US has been our primary tariff in this area. So how do you see the role of MDBs and international organizations in this context?
Fantastic question. And well, the first is, yes, we have seen a shrinking of Department of Justice resources, you know, closing of certain offices, the civil division, a gutting of the civil division. So there's no question about that the DOJ initiative has affected enforcement and the ability, you know, to bring these cases. But on your second point, it's something I should have mentioned, because when I see this international context, I see, and especially you, given your position as chair of the IDB Sanctions Committee, the MDBs now have a critical role to play. When you consider first that, you know, the types of conduct that are prohibited fall directly in line with what we're talking about: corruption, fraud, collusion. And then second, the reach of MDBs, the amount of companies, big and small, that participate in MDB finance projects and are subject to the compliance expectations and the requirements of not engaging in prohibited and sanctionable conduct. The MDBs have a central role to play, and it's something we've been talking a lot internally at our firm about. It's something we're seeing, and then you consider IDB Invest and this next chapter and all of the initiatives and money behind development efforts in key pockets throughout Latin America. When we talk about the future of this space, I do believe it is impossible to talk about it without considering MDBs and their role front and center. And then the final thing I'll say is, you know, the core MDBs have done a great job on your internal collaboration and alignment, but there are others out there like CAF and like CABE and, you know, kind of the more junior ones and in Latin America that are also having an impact, and that, at least based on what I've seen, have shown an interest in modifying their sanctions and investigations work. So there might be more opportunity for collaboration alignment there, but I think it has to be front and center to any company's consideration. If a company operating in the global market is not considering its exposure to MDB, the MDB sanctions world, then it is not adequately assessing its own risk. Thank you for that. I have one more minute, then Rafael, unfortunately, I have to jump to something else, but are there any final questions? And this has been so great. It's so good to see you all and speak with you.
Questions?
Hi, Matt, really quick. So I'm assuming from our conversation that you wouldn't pause FCPA, but there are any changes that you would make if you could?
Yeah, any changes? That's a great question. I do think there is an opportunity to, oh gosh, that's a great question. We've been speculating on what the government will do. I haven't really so yes, I think there is an opportunity for FCPA enforcement to do more in deferring to other jurisdictions, right? Too often, the Department of Justice and the SEC has taken the lead. There have been moments like with the piling on policy. There has been recognition of the important contributions that other governments have made. But U.S. authorities really are at a place now that they can be the ones that provide the evidence and push other jurisdictions to do their own work. Now, of course, that's happened, but that could be more of a central element of enforcement policy at DOJ and SEC. In terms of interpreting the statute and the reach of the statute, I do think that things near the end of the Biden administration, for example, had gotten a bit too out of line in terms of compliance expectations for companies. I mean, you all are from Latin America and you know how prominent WhatsApp is, and telling a company that its employees can't use ephemeral messaging. I mean, how do you actually get a company to do that? Now, there are companies that have been responsible and found ways to put more controls around messaging. That's a good thing. But in a way, I feel like DOJ's and SEC's compliance expectations were at a point where they were really beginning to misalign from the way business is actually done. So that's an opportunity for improvement. So I like that idea. I mean, that might be an opportunity to write an article, right? You know, now that DOJ is reevaluating, hey, DOJ, here are some thoughts on some updates you might consider. But another great question. So thanks for asking that.
I just want to thank you for being with us. It was really good. I think the questions show how important the topic is, and I think it was very enlightening to have you here with us. The topic is indeed an important but hard issue. I think the only thing we can expect is that once we have the regulation or any news, you come back and share your thoughts with us. Let's hope the DOJ thinks as you do and they improve the regulation. That would be a good idea.
Let's hope so. And I will certainly continue to be in touch. I have plans to be down there in May and again in June. So I hope to see many of you in person. And thanks again for this opportunity. I really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. You have a good day.
All right, goodbye, everybody.